Both these players had an absolutely impeccable day yesterday. Both of them 7-0, but like the desk said, there can only be one undefeated player after this match. So let's get it underway. Take a look at the opening hands here. Pretty good for both players as we start things off with an island from Andrew Cuneo and pass to Arne with a Temple of Deceit.
Yeah, this is pretty much perfect hands from both players in the matchup. For Arna, he doesn't really want to be messing around with things like Ruin Crab in game one. He's more looking for that pure aggression that the Rogues package can bring. And with 2 copies of Thieves Guild Enforcer and 2 copies of Soaring Thought Thief, plus a disruption spell in the Drown in the Loch, he's got pretty much everything he's looking for there. On the other side for Cuneo, there's Ramp, there's Disruption in the all-important Elspeth's Nightmare, and there's a Maze Mind Tome to try to rebuild should something get countered by like Drown in the Loch. So I think again both players really getting exactly the type of hands that they're looking for in this matchup.
Now it's all going to come down to the top of the library, which one plays nicer with which of these players. And the one thing that you mentioned in this ultimatum deck, which you don't typically see, is this Maze Mind Tome. Do you think this is like, you know, a really cool inclusion for this list that a lot of other Sultai ultimatum decks should possibly consider?
I think it's really a nod and a matter of how do you want to be attacking the mirror. When the mirror is all about trading blows, trading counter spells and discard spells, and trying to make sure the other person isn't resolving an ultimatum, a card that can provide you multiple pieces of card advantage at instant speed so you don't have to necessarily put your defenses down and make yourself exposed to a counter spell or exposed to just not being able to counter an ultimatum is quite powerful. Whether it's the best card in the slot, this team certainly decided it is. I'm not sure. I know that other teams were looking at maybe some more spell lands, cards like Palaka Predation as ways of attacking the matchup, and it really comes down to where you think the edge comes from.
All right, well, we'll see what part it plays in this matchup, as we do have a Thieves Guild Enforcer on the battlefield here for Arne, and Maze Mind Tome. Just going to keep scrying, drawing cards here for Andrew Cuneo as he sets up for potentially a Elspeth's Nightmare next turn. Just chipping in there with the one Thieves Guild Enforcer, not committing too much to the battlefield, holding on to those instant speed spells, as Andrew Cuneo has drawn a second copy of Elspeth's Nightmare. Now, this is something that we didn't see in the match that we covered. It's basically a deja vu all over again, seeing Rogues versus Ultimatum, but we didn't see Elspeth's Nightmare in that other deck. Now, how important do you think it is up against Rogues?
It's perhaps the most important card in the matchup from Sultai's point of view, just because not only is it a removal spell on some of the cheap creatures, it's a disruption spell to get rid of a counter spell that may stop your ultimatum, and it exiles the graveyard, making your opponent's Lurrus eventually weaker. The reason we don't see Andrew go for it in this position is Elspeth's Nightmare on a Thieves Guild Enforcer is extremely risky because it destroys a creature with power 2 or less. If your opponent had 2 rogues in response, as Arna obviously did there, then the Elspeth's Nightmare first removal ability would fizzle. On the other hand, on a Soaring Thought Thief, it's much more powerful. It's much more likely to resolve, though looking at Arna's hand with another copy of Soaring Thought Thief now, that means that he's set himself up very nicely to just be Elspeth's Nightmare proof here, and may just snowball this game away from Andrew before he's even able to use his all-important Elspeth's Nightmares.
It certainly looks like that is the case, as now we are swinging in here for 8 points of damage. Cuneo is going to go down to 11 and doesn't have a way to answer these creatures just yet. We do know this deck is packing a bunch of removal, and he's going to have to start digging for it here. Goes to the Maze Mind Tome, potentially also has the Omen of the Sun that he can cast on the end step and try dig for the all-important removal spells against this. But on the other side of things, we do see Arne has a Drown in the Loch, and there is plenty of cards in that graveyard able to counter whatever it is Cuneo could find.
Yeah, you see Andrew actually opting to go for the Omen of the Sea rather than drawing with the Maze Mind Tome, recognizing that he needs as many looks at cards as possible. So he's going to go Omen plus Scry and potentially another Scry on his upkeep if he hasn't found what he's looking for. That's why we see that upkeep stop set. The big problem here is he doesn't have enough mana, and the cards in his hand don't do anything to fight through this Drown in the Loch. So he found the Shadow's Verdict, great. It's going to get countered, and unfortunately, there's already 11 points of damage on the other side of the battlefield, so this game is just over.
It is at that, unfortunately. Cuneo doesn't know it just yet, so we'll do everything we can to stay in the Shadow's Verdict on the stack. Easy peasy, Drown in the Loch Arne Huschenbeth is going to win this rather convincingly, as I think everyone expected it to. Rogues is just so well positioned in this matchup, having the tempo game, having the control package. It's super, super good still against the Sultai Ultimatum deck.
Yeah, the draw from Arna was just incredible. He had all the early pressure he wanted, and when the time came, he had the all important Drowned Lock to just close it out, seal the deal. And Andrew did a good job of fighting it. He played around what Arna was presenting, but at some point, it was just all too much.
So let's take a look at the sideboarding decisions here. How does Cuneo come back against this rogue deck?
So we talked about this previously, but a lot of the game plan from Sultai Ultimatum changes post board. Yesterday we saw Stansifka boarding out quite a few pieces of ramp. Today we're seeing Andrew go even a bit bigger, taking out multiple copies of Emergent Ultimatum, which I think a game plan that many players and teams decided was the way to go in this matchup. Instead, you're bringing in a lot more removal, and something we do see him bringing in is 3 copies of Shark Typhoon. Shark Typhoon really powerful in the matchup just because it allows you to interact with the board at instant speed in an uncounterable way. The flying creatures can do a great job of either trading or just blocking rogues, and that means that the aggressive game plan that Arna is bringing to the table is in many ways neutralized, which can be quite powerful for the Sultai Ultimatum deck to do the rest of their things.
Both players are ready to get game 2 underway here. Cuneo is going to have to find everything that he can possibly use against this very aggressive rogues deck. When we take a look at this hand, it's not ideal, but there's a bunch of removal in it, so we're going to keep it and hope to find land number 3 off the top of the library.
Yeah, the most awkward part of this hand is just the fact that Fabled Passage on turn 2 is not an untapped land, so Andrew isn't even able to deploy this Maze Mind Tome until turn 3 to try to start drawing cards or even just scrying and try to smooth out this draw. So certainly a bit awkward, but should he find that third land, he's going to be in a pretty great position to try to remove the creatures Arna is presenting from there and stabilize the board in order to take over with cards like that Maze Mind Tome.
So a pause here from Arne, just thinking, how do I want to play my first turn? Kicks things off with the pathway, and looks like we're going to go for the Thieves Guild Enforcer on the end step.
Yeah, I think Arna just really trying to make sure that there's no downside to playing this pathway on the black mana side, making sure that there's no real way to get punished and planning out multiple of his turns in advance. The hand here from him is a bit awkward. Thieves Guild Enforcer, the only real form of mill or pressure, and perhaps not even wanting to expose it to a potential S+ Nightmare here while he doesn't have another rogue, saying that I'm not really backing this up with more pressure. So if I play this now, what I'm doing is I'm playing a 1/1 that mills my opponent for 2 with 0 follow-up. And opting not to play that is, I think, a really heads-up play that I like from Arna's side of the battlefield, considering he knows that Andrew's list is packing cards like Elspeth's Nightmare that can heavily punish this exposed play.
Careful song and dance here between the two players. The option to keep the Jawari Disruption up, but being the third land drawn, plays it as the land instead and goes for the Maze Mind Tome. Passes the turn back to Arna, who draws an Of One Mind. Another pretty powerful addition to the card that helps to refill the hand if we do get the human and non-human creature on the battlefield. It's just going to play it here for the full price, though, and see what he can find off the top of the library to get this mill plan going and find some more rogues.
Yeah, Arna was considering playing it for full cost there.
Mm-hmm.
Would have had to discard a card on the end step, considering he was on the draw here and has not played anything other than it. May have been worth it regardless, just to smooth out his draws a bit and try to put himself in a better position. But because he has that Zagoth Triumph, he is able to cycle on Andrew's end step regardless, and just opting to present untapped mana and save the of one mind if he's ever able to make a more tempo-oriented play with it and cast it for 1 mana. That's going to be big in the matchup.
Oh, so does indeed cycle that Triumph away, finding a second Thieves Guild Enforcer. Always better in pairs.
Yeah, pair of Thieves Guild Enforcers representing a 6-card mill is huge, as they can pretty much single-handedly turn on anything you have waiting in the wings that requires cards in your opponent's graveyard.
Passes the turn back, nothing doing on the main phase, and a Darkboard pathway drawn for Andrew Cuneo here, who's happily plodding along, finding the lands, but just waiting patiently for Arne to make the first move.
Yeah, this hand from Andrew is shaped up really nicely. This Maze My Tome, again, it's really doing what we were looking for in the matchup, what Andrew's looking for in the matchup, which is just coming down early and allowing him to play a more reactive game plan rather than be forced to be proactive. Now he can remove the first Thieves Guild Enforcer in response to the second one, keep the board size down, and then ensure that he can try to untap and go Elspeth's Nightmare potentially to remove the Thieves Guild Enforcer next turn. The other option is letting it resolve and trying to go for a board wipe on his turn, but that is a little risky as at the moment he's not ensuring he has the mana up to leave negate available, and if his board wipe gets countered, we may see a repeat of game one where multiple Thieves Guild Enforcers just run away with it.
Yeah, and trying to keep your graveyard a certain size to keep things like Into the Story shut off is very important against this rogue deck. You know, you don't want to give them the resources that they need, the refill that they're looking for.
Yeah, it's part of the game plan from Rose is very much snowballing. So once things get rolling, once the Enter the Stories cost 4, once the Thieves Guild Enforcers have 3 power, things just start adding up very quickly, which is why we see Andrew, who is on a slower deck, prioritize trying to take things at his pace rather than letting Arne dictate the pace of play.
Trying to bait out the counter there, perhaps. Playing the of one Mind. Still has a land for turn. And did find 2 Skyclave Shades, did Arne Huschenbeth. So can deploy one of those. But first things first, going to attack in here just for 1. And keep up the Thieves Guild Enforcers for the end step, perhaps.
Yeah, we don't really have a count of Andrew's graveyard just yet. It is 6, so that Soaring Thought Thief coming into play would bump it up to 8. Unfortunately, that means that if Andrew goes for this Elspeth's Nightmare on the Soaring Thought Thief, on the Thieves Guild Enforcer, the Thought Thief in response would essentially counter the ability, and that would also mean that Negate isn't able to counter the Thought Thief. So this is a really good sequence for Arne. Now, the saving grace for Andrew is on his next draw step, Elspeth's Nightmare will get a look at Arne's hand, will know that there isn't currently a counterspell available. Now there's Drown Lock, but he is able to work around that, which means that he could set up for a board wipe on the next turn.
It's going to be super important as now we do have that buff across the board here for these rogues. In for 6 points of damage, down to 13 goes Cuneo, and the clock is ticking now for him to get a board wipe resolved. As you did mention, we do have a Drown in the Lock to protect against that, but having the ability to go board wipe into negate with counterspell backup is going to be huge for Andrew Cuneo here.
Andrew has tapped out on Arne's end step. This is Arne's window to resolve Into the Story before Andrew gets a chance to discard it with Elspeth's Nightmare. Doing it on the end step means he will have to discard a card, but considering he has 2 copies of Skyclave Shade in hand, that's not the biggest cost. You can just cast those shades from the graveyard with the landfall trigger, so not at all a big deal. And now that Into the Story is resolved and Arne has access to 2 counterspells, he's feeling quite safe about his position. He has another Into the Story. He has plenty of tools to combat what Andrew's doing. Yes, Skyclave Shade can get exiled from the graveyard with Elspeth's Nightmare's 3rd chapter, but Arne has another turn before that happens, so he's safe to discard it for now.
Chapter 2 of Elspeth's Nightmare triggers, takes a look, and sees the bad news in hand of 2 counterspells and another Into the Story, as well as Agadeem's Awakening. Not too much stuff dead in the bin right now, so I don't think that that's high on his priority list here to pick. What would you take in this situation?
I think you have to take the Into the Story from Andrew's point of view. This turn is a Shadow's Verdict backed up by a Negate, the Shadow's Verdict will absolutely draw one of the counterspells out from Arne's hand, but he only has the mana to cast 1. The Shadow's Verdict will exile the Shade from the graveyard as well as the 2 creatures from the battlefield, leaving Arne with essentially 1 counterspell and 1 Shade, and then there's no follow-up of it Into the Story, but Andrew instead going for the Disdainful Stroke and trying to cut down on the counters available from Arne.
All right, so here you go. Perfect information now in hand. Extinction Event. The go-to here for Andrew Cuneo.
This
Interesting
is an
choice.
awkward line from Andrew as it doesn't really force Arna's hand on the counterspell. Extinction Event is only getting rid of one creature here. The Skyclave Shade is staying in the graveyard, which means that for Arna, he can just let it resolve, untap, play one or two Skyclave Shades if he wants. Depends on how much he wants to play around another board wipe spell. And he still has this Into the Story plus Drown in the Loch available. So Arna absolutely not feeling like his hand is forced here. And for Andrew, this measure might mean that he's forced to use Shadow's Verdict against the next turn, and he's now essentially used two board wipe spells to
Hmm.
answer the same three creatures, which isn't really where you want to be in this matchup.
Not at all, as we see Omen of the Sea come down, sends both cards to the bottom and draws a Bark Channel Pathway and finds another Omen of the Sea. Elspeth's Nightmare will trigger. There goes the graveyard, but not too terrible. You know, having gotten that Skyclave Shade out of the bin and still presenting 6 power on this battlefield with plenty to back it up in hand there for Arne.
Yeah, Arna's hand is looking great. This Into the Story, extremely scary as Andrew is slowly running out of resources. These Omen of the Seas are helping quite a bit keep his cards up. But again, if that Into the Story can resolve, which currently Arna has the tools to force it through, Andrew would be in a fair bit of trouble.
Yeah, not looking too good here for Andrew Cuneo, as Arne is just going to keep pressing the advantage, holds up the Into the Story, and looks like we're going to go for that on the end step, but he's just, deciding what he wants to commit here. Thieves Guild Enforcer is another potential threat that he can get down. So let's see what he does here on the end step.
Arne's recognition of this board state is interesting. He's saying that if I use this Into the Story and Andrew counters it, the number of counters that Andrew potentially has access to is not that much. So it's much more likely that the Drown in the Loch is going to be good enough to counter the next piece of board wipe that Andrew presents, which means that Arne doesn't really mind exposing this Into the Story here if that position works out that way.
I mean, at this rate, he's not going to need it. He's just swinging in here for 9 points of damage. Cuneo's down to 5, and he really needs something here to keep him in this matchup.
Yeah, this is the awkward part now because Arna actually drew another Thieves Guild Enforcer. It means that even if Andrew untaps and goes for that Shadow's Verdict backed up with the negate play to counter the Drown in the Loch, he will still be facing down a 3-power creature at least on Arna's turn, as that is another flash creature available to him.
Oof, 2 lands on top of the library found with that Omen of the Sea. They're going to go straight to the bottom. What does he find on top of the library?
Yeah, unfortunately for Andrew, the Shark Typhoon that he scried to the top of his deck was milled by that secondary Thieves Guild Enforcer being played, so he doesn't even have access to the flash creature he had left on top, and now he's in a position where he's being forced to take the same play he had available to him 3 turns ago,
Mm-hmm.
but now he's at 5 life, and Arna still has plenty of tools to combat everything Andrew is doing.
Yeah, Arne just has an answer for everything that Cuneo is trying to do here. Shadow's Verdict is on the stack. Arne can respond with an Into the Story as well as Drown in the Loch. Perhaps find another counterspell there. The world is his oyster at this point.
Yeah, double counterspell would just do it. Andrew only has the negate available to him. He has to force this Shadow's Verdict through to survive, so can't even afford to counter the Into the Story. But if this is bait from Arna and Andrew does go for it, he would get the bad news, and Mystical Dispute is enough to do it. Andrew will try to negate this Drown in the Loch with only 2 mana remaining. Mystical Dispute will get the job done on the negate, and Arne Huschenbeth will be taking this match up to
So
8-0 for the challenger.
that's amazing. So our only undefeated player at this point, as soon as we hit a tackle with these creatures, is going to be Arne Huschenbeth. But Cuneo won't even give him that opportunity. See the fist pump there. He is ecstatic with that win, and hopefully he can keep it running. We want to see someone with 15-0 at the end of the day. That would be amazing.